I'm going to provide you one illustrative framework for a fiscal sustainability amendment. But before I do, I want to remind you that what really matters is debt to GDP and interest as a percent of the budget. And that while we desperately need a fiscal responsibility amendment, that even with a fiscal responsibility amendment, certain things are going to happen in order to restore fiscal sustainability. And many of those are going to have to be done by the Congress of the United States. So while they're part of the problem today, they're ultimately going to have to be part of the solution, even if we get a state-led fiscal sustainability convention and ratification by 3/4 of the state. First, we need additional transparency and integrity with regard to our numbers. You saw that, believe it or not, I added up the numbers. Over 2/3 of our financial obligations are not on the balance sheet of the United States. Stated differently, less than 1/3 of our financial obligations are on the balance sheet. Secondly, we're going to need to revise our budget process and controls. The statutory provisions have not worked. Do you know how many times in my lifetime Congress has passed a budget and all appropriations bills on time? The answer is four times, and they're going to fail this year too. We have to reprioritize and reduce discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is now less than 30% of total federal spending. And all of the express and enumerated responsibilities envisioned by the founders in the Constitution are in discretionary spending. All of them, including national defense. We're going to have to restructure our social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, secure, and affordable. We're going to have additional targeted investments that actually are real investments that generate a positive rate of return and enhance economic growth rather than reduce it. We're going to have to increase revenues, in part through additional economic growth, but in part through tax reforms. We're going to have a fiscal sustainability commission to set the table for Congress for a required vote that actively engages the American people before it makes recommendations. And now I transition to, we need a fiscal responsibility constitutional amendment. So in doing that, here's one possible approach. The approach is a public debt to GDP constitutional limit. In fact, two public debt to GDP constitutional limits. The first one I will refer to as a credit card limit. Right now, we have no credit card limit. So it'll be an overall public debt to GDP limit with limited exceptions. For example, a formal declaration of war. The last time we declared war was World War II, but we've had a number of conflicts since then that we called wars, but technically were not wars. They cost a lot of money and a lot of lives. Or for specified reasons, when you get a supermajority vote in both houses of Congress and the signature of the president, very high bar. Second, a future public debt to GDP target, which is lower than where we are today, more reasonable, more sustainable, clearly lower than the credit card limit, with annual targets, triggers, and automatic enforcement mechanisms if Congress fails to act, with limited annual exceptions, same kind of exceptions. And no matter if we get this, we need to have an enforcement mechanism. Without an enforcement mechanism, it can be ignored, other than the political pressure, which is real. And the one possibility is to have the violation of either provision would mean that current members of Congress could not stand for re-election. There are other approaches you could take. That you get a certain percentage of the states would have to override. There are different options. And I think we all need to understand that ultimately the convention delegates will decide what to propose. They're going to need to be constrained to the subject of the convention. They're going to need ideas, but ultimately they will decide. Now, what's the benefit of a debt to GDP approach? There are several benefits. Number one, it represents an approach that most economists can agree on. Whether they're conservative, progressive, whatever, debt to GDP, a vast majority of economists will agree that's what really matters. Secondly, it's an approach that has the greatest potential to achieve bipartisan and trans-ideological support. I can tell you that requiring the federal government to have a balanced budget on an annual basis will never get bipartisan support. And by the way, I can also tell you that 49 to 50 states have balanced budget amendments, and they are abused regularly. They're a bad joke, especially in the last state that I lived in, Connecticut, which the way they balance their budget, they borrow money to balance their budget. That is no joke. They balance cash flows. We need one that's pro-growth oriented. Why do I say pro-growth oriented? And this is because if you grow the denominator faster than the numerator, you're making progress, even if you have a deficit or you're increasing debt. That's what we did after World War II. We didn't pay down the debt. We grew the denominator faster than the numerator. But demographics are working against us now, unlike World War II, and healthcare costs are clearly working against us now. We need to have an approach that allows elected officials to decide the proper mix of spending cuts, additional investments, and revenue increases. What we care about is the bottom line, which is debt to GDP. Is the problem primarily a spending problem? Absolutely yes. Do we want to grow the economy faster? Absolutely yes. Are we going to need additional revenues? Absolutely yes. And you don't want to box them in as to how to do it. And then last, it has an automatic enforcement mechanism and accountability mechanism. So these are the benefits. Now, if you also look, most other countries focus on, to have constraints, focus on debt to GDP. Europe, for example, European Union has a 60% debt to GDP limit. Ours doesn't need to be that low. Most countries, but not all countries, comply with it. The ones in the north typically do. The ones in the south typically don't. Different story. It's kind of the opposite in our country, isn't it? You know, kind of the ones in the south typically comply and the ones in the north don't, but that's a different story. I won't go there. So those are the benefits of a public debt to GDP approach. That's one way. But now I'm going to offer 2 copies of my book to whoever can answer these questions correctly. First question: what is the name of the past great power who was both a republic and an empire that fell from being a global superpower to being not in existence anymore because of the following reasons: fiscal irresponsibility, political instability, moral decay. She had her hand up. Wait a minute. She had her hand up. So moral decay, overextended military, and inability to control its borders. You had your hand up first, so Rome is correct, okay? The Roman Republic and then became an empire. Do those sound familiar? Do those factors sound familiar? Second question. All right, don't raise your hand until the end and then we'll see. All right, second. Which American leader warned us about 4 things: excessive debt, foreign wars, regionalism, and factionalism?
George Washington.
George Washington. If you give me your address and name, I will send you one myself, okay? I've only got 2 with me. Thank you very much. That's correct. We need to learn from history. We need to learn from others. We need to take steps to create a better future. You need to be part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.